Good morning, TMF week, and good afternoon and good evening from where you guys are at. I know I have a new angle for you guys today. Don't worry. Don't be alarmed. I'm still the same old Danny that you guys know and love from the last 2 days. So we got day 3. It's going to be fun. You know, if you guys can hear me in the chat, let me know. I always have to check. Let me know where you're tuning in from. We always like to see it. I want to show Suzanne, you know, the wonderful wide audience that we have kind of piling in. And yeah, you know, is anyone drinking anything fun? Has anyone got any morning rituals that they've decided now for TMF week? You've done it the last 2 days, and now you're doing it on day 3. You know, please let us know. We love the interaction, you guys. You guys have been such a good audience the last couple of days, and we're thankful that you are all here. So, without further ado, the housekeeping that I always get to. So, all the sessions are going to be recorded and available at the end of the day. I know that there's been some issues, I think, uploading them. They might be the end of the event. I will confirm with Kim later when those are going to go up, and I will make sure that we send you guys all a lovely message when they do. All the attendees, you guys are all going to get a certificate of attendance for the entire TMF week at the end of this, at the end of the conference. It's going to be a nice little handy dandy certificate saying you were here. And all the questions we're going to be answering at the end of the presentation. I'm going to mention later, we're doing 15 minutes of QA, and then we're going to have our networking breaks in the lounge where Suzanne and I will be hanging out. We'll be able to answer any questions in a more intimate setting if you don't want to kind of raise your hand in front of the entire audience. So don't worry, all your questions are going to be answered. So you guys are pretty much experts at TMF week, but for those of you that have not attended any sessions yet, this is how we do things here. We're going to have a 30-minute presentation. We're going to do some Q&A with Suzanne after her presentation. Then I'm going to introduce the next session, and then we're going to have our networking break in all of the lounges. Without further ado, Suzanne has been sitting here so patiently next to me. Suzanne, have you been having a good morning?
Yes, yep, I have, and which is funny because anyone who's present who knows me knows I am not a morning person.
Oh no!
And of course I'm in Central Time, so it's 8 a.m. here. So
Oh my God, you're a trooper.
I've been up long enough that I'm awake and my energetic self. So
amazing, amazing. Well, I cannot wait to see your presentation. I'm going to leave the floor to you, and I will be back for the Q&A session.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. And he actually stole what I was going to say. I was going to say good morning, afternoon, and evening, no matter where you're at. And today I'm going to be talking about small pharma. So if that's what you came for, you're in the right place. I'm going to start by introducing myself before discussing the limitations that impact small pharma companies. And then we'll discuss essential TMF practices, some key questions to ask CROs, and I'll provide some tips on adapting what may be considered standard practices in the industry. So my name is Suzanne Turner. I'm the owner of ICE Consulting and the host of the Heart of the Trial podcast, which I'm super excited to say the first episode releases Monday. So I hope you all tune in. I've been in clinical research for over 11 years and specifically in TMF management that entire time. I started out at a large CRO when TMFs were still fully paper, so aging myself just a little bit. By time I left that CRO, I was a manager in the TMF department. After that, I worked for a consulting company that focused on inspection readiness. And while I was there, I performed TMF reviews, I worked with sponsors, and I was a manager aligned with onboarding and training new employees. Currently, I'm a TMF consultant. I work directly with small pharma sponsors, and I do pretty much anything TMF related that they need. So throughout the last couple of years, I've attended several events such as this one that are full of amazing information shared by our peers that show what's becoming standard practice in the industry to ensure TMF health. But while attending these events, I started to notice a trend, and that was representatives from small pharma. They were raising their hands and saying, you know, what about me? This isn't going to work for me. And having had the opportunity to work with small pharma sponsors now, it's allowed me to see and experience that for myself. So I want to discuss why some of these standard practices don't tend to work for them. And to be honest, when I was initially working on the slide deck, I had several things listed out, but I quickly realized that all of them came back to one thing, and that's their resources. So simply put, small pharma companies are limited by their resources to follow the processes that larger sponsor companies can take advantage of. I've broken this down into two buckets of resources that I feel almost all of these limitations fall into. The first is their budget. So smaller pharma companies don't have the extensive budget found in large pharma companies. They have to be selective in where the money's placed, do in-depth comparison, and provide a lot of justification for approval if their top choice is more costly. So this means that they usually do not have the tools or systems that larger companies have, or the ones they do have are limited in their capabilities. So the second is their personnel. Unlike larger companies, it's not uncommon to have a single individual as an entire department or to have individuals acting in multiple roles. And I can say as a TMF consultant, that's absolutely my experience. It's not uncommon for me to be the entire TMF department for a sponsor. It's also common for these individuals to be consultants like I am, so that means they probably have limited hours. And this loops back into that first bucket because the limited budget impacts being able to bring in more personnel, and that leaves everyone working at capacity. So now that we know the limitations, what can we do to work within them? And the key to all of it is to ensure that you have standards and to create process documents including those standards. This is going to be the foundation to ensuring a healthy and inspection-ready TMF. By working through the process of knowing what the sponsor standards will be, it will allow you to determine where you need to adapt. I have seen sponsors rely solely on their CRO when it comes to the TMF process because they are managing the TMF. But how can you hold your CRO or any internal employees accountable to standards if you don't have them in place? You can't reach the goal line if you don't know where it is, right? So there are some standards that you do need to determine early on related to the study process, and there are others that will come up as questions are asked and you run into unexpected situations. This means that determining your standards is going to be an ongoing process. As questions come up throughout studies, and once you encounter a new situation, you will need to make decisions which you can turn into standards to ensure consistency. Because as we all know, consistency is key to everything TMF related within a single study and across studies. So I'm currently working with a client that has 3 different eTMF platforms in use via their CROs with the intention of a 4th by the end of the year. So I've really been putting a focus on working with them to determine the standards to ensure consistency no matter which eTMF is being used. And I'm sure there are many of you that are in similar situations and possibly struggling. So standards and consistency are going to make things easier for the study team members and for any vendor managing the TMF. It will also make things easier during inspections as you will easily be able to speak to it. And as you determine standards, it's essential to document them. It's funny how we can be such sticklers on other departments documenting their decisions, but can sometimes forget to do this ourselves. So find a good way to document those decisions to ensure the consistency and have a resource available to the team. So one of the processes I encourage sponsors to go through to help determine standards is through the analysis of their TMF system. So sponsors need to have someone who understands the functionality of the eTMF platform being utilized, whether it's an internal eTMF or the CRO's eTMF. So have them walk you through a demonstration and don't hesitate to ask questions. This analysis will start with what the system can do. And once you know what your eTMF is capable of, you're able to determine how you want to utilize those functions and what can be taken advantage of. For example, if the system allows you to log quality issues directly into the system, this could eliminate a lot of emails or an external tracker when quality issues are identified. And you can probably pull a report directly from the system as well. Another great example is any TMF health reports or dashboards that may be available. If they are available and plan to be used, you want to ensure that it's understood what the data shows. I recently experienced with an eTMF vendor that they had a dashboard, but it ended up not being useful to the sponsor because it wasn't showing a complete TMF. It was only focusing on the placeholders. So what may be even more important than knowing what the system can do is understanding what the system can't do. Looking at the system, more than likely, as the sponsor, you're going to have some expectations of what it should be able to do. So the question is if it can actually do that. If not, this is an area where adapting or building out a process is going to be necessary. It's important to have those discussions with the CRO early on in case there's a cost impact or a higher risk of TMF health. So to give you a starting point, I've listed just a few examples of functionalities that you may want to understand about the system. This includes if the system has a two-step QC process, if it documents certified copies, or if personnel names can be selected on documents. So be sure that when you're discussing the functions that it's clear if they are automatic or have to be turned on for your study. This is something I encountered recently with a client as it was assumed the certified copy process was in place, but it turns out it was a function that had to be turned on. And by the time that was realized, it was almost the end of the study. I also want to encourage you that even if you don't feel like some of the functions may be necessary to your current situation, to take note of what the system can do and don't hesitate to ask the questions as these could be part of your future growth goals. So as I mentioned earlier, throughout the process, there needs to be documentation. And the best way to do this is in process documents. Even if the sponsor is using a CRO to manage their TMF, this is important as it will give a starting point that can be used to measure CRO processes and SOPs against. It will also provide a reference to help with questions during the CRO selection process and a guide throughout the TMF startup process. If a CRO is being utilized, it will help ensure that your sponsor-specific guidance is being built into the CRO TMF process documents. This is important because the TMF belongs to the sponsor, even though it's being managed by the CRO, right? So the sponsor needs to ensure that the CRO documents adequately cover this. In other words, you can't just rely on the CRO documents because those are from their perspective. And some are going to do better than others when building in the sponsor perspective. So another advantage to having documents in place is that you can do a simple copy and paste of any needed sections. This will be beneficial in situations where you're using multiple CROs or systems like my client is, to ensure that you're receiving that consistency. So there are 3 essential process documents that I always advise the sponsor to have in place. I've listed them here along with key items that I would advise you ensure is included within them. So the first probably seems obvious, but it's necessary to mention due to its importance, and that is the trial master file SOP. So even if the CRO's SOPs are being followed for TMF management, that is not going to cover sponsor internal processes. And I've seen sponsors make this mistake. They just completely rely on that CRO. The sponsor's SOP should consider what they would expect if they were managing the TMF, but can easily build in wording to indicate when the CROs may trump it, or that the TMF plan needs to identify when the CRO's SOP trumps the sponsors. The SOP should include how the TMF setup process and access, including training, should be managed. For example, what is required of individuals before they should be given access to a study? It should also cover what is expected of the CRO when it comes to TMF reviews, such as frequency, and what is expected of the sponsor team to have oversight of the TMF. Another key area is something that isn't always thought of during the initial process, but how is a sponsor going to handle the transfer and archival of the TMF? And prior to the transfer, I highly recommend having something in place that requires sponsor approval that the TMF is complete and acceptable before allowing the CRO to transfer it. It's easier to have any issues handled while they are still in possession of it. And again, I've seen this happen where a small sponsor accepted the TMF and then afterwards had to figure out what they were going to do with it. And so it may seem a little overwhelming, but if there are processes in place that provide ongoing oversight throughout the study, it shouldn't be cumbersome, and it should be fairly easy to approve the transfer. It should also make the post-transfer checks easier. Again, I'd advise this whole process be documented in the SOP. Also consider what will you do with the TMF once it's received. I've seen some interesting yet scary choices from sponsors. So I will really encourage you to think of this process early. There are great vendors out there to work with during archiving if you don't currently have one or have a system that you can store your TMF. I know there is a session Friday morning that includes Archivum. So if you need guidance in TMF archival, I really encourage you to attend that session and listen to what they have to say. The next document is going to be a TMF plan. If you often work with CROs, you may feel this isn't necessary because the CRO probably has a template. However, by having a sponsor template, you will have items ready to transfer into the CRO template to save time. It will also allow a comparison to ensure the CRO is covering all key items that the sponsor requires. For example, if you have the sponsor oversight process outlined, you can copy and paste it into the CRO's TMF plan. If you need a starting point, the TMF reference model does have a TMF plan template available that can be updated to suit your sponsor specific needs, or use one you have in place for a current study. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Similarly, the TMF index is another document I would encourage you to have. Any sponsor artifacts that you may have can be built into your TMF index. And these can be added to the CRO index to ensure they are filed and that everyone knows where they should be filed. It's also possible the CRO index doesn't include as much detail or guidance that the sponsor might prefer. For example, who is responsible for an artifact or zone. Another document I've included on here that may be necessary is some version of a TMF standards document. If utilized, it should only include items not documented elsewhere. This may be something that outlines Alcoa requirements, scanning expectations, dating requirements, etc. Or it could be something as simple as an Excel that documents decisions to help ensure consistency. So once there are standards and processes in place, the sponsor will have an easier time of building a list of questions to ask CROs during the qualification or startup phases. Once you know where the goal line is, it's easier to determine if the vendor will be able to help you reach it while maintaining quality. I've provided several questions that I feel are key to understanding the CRO's TMF process. They are questions I ask, as I feel that their responses to these questions will tell me if there could be a high risk of quality issues within the CRO process, meaning more sponsor oversight is needed, or that processes may need to be adjusted or developed to meet the sponsor expectations. So this starts with understanding their QC process. And for clarification, when I say QC, I'm talking about their document and metadata review process from when a document's uploaded and flows through the approval process. And ideally, this is going to be 2 steps to ensure that the person applying the metadata is different from the individual approving it for higher quality control. And if that's the case, then if that isn't the case, then the sponsor needs to find out what additional processes are in place to ensure document and filing quality. A key question for me is always how they perform their completeness reviews. Again, for clarification, when I say completeness, I'm talking about ensuring that any documents that may be missing beyond any obvious placeholders are identified and tracked for collection. An example of this is CVs based on delegation logs. I want to know that a CV is missing for John Smith, not just that a CV is missing. I also want to ensure this is being done in a timely manner. As we all know, the longer you wait to collect a record, the harder it's going to be. Access is always a good discussion topic so that the sponsor understands how much access they will be given to the CRO's TMF system. Will you have the ability to upload your own documents or log quality issues? How do they handle auditor access in case of an inspection, etc.? It's not uncommon to be provided a read-only access from a CRO, which will impact other areas of your process, such as how sponsor records make it into the TMF. And understanding their certified copy process is also ideal. Since we want to keep paper to a minimum, this will help ensure compliance. This can also lead into a discussion on electronic signature compliance. And the final question I have listed here is extremely important and sometimes overlooked, but how will they be providing the eTMF at the end of the study and what will be included? This is important to ensure it actually works for the sponsor. Throughout the process of creating your standards, the process documents, determining your CRO capabilities, you're going to start seeing areas that need to be adapted. And this is the process that I follow when something comes up during a study and we need to brainstorm the next steps. So I start by ensuring that I understand the actual regulatory requirements and that the teams aren't pushing in an area just because they're used to doing or seeing something. An example I recently had of this is a client reached out to me with questions on the 1572s as the CRO wasn't collecting them when there were sub-I updates. I was able to explain and provide the documentation that it's not a regulatory requirement, even though they're used to seeing it. So they then determined a process with the CRO that would help them track the sub-Is for the study. Determine what can be centralized to one person to remove additional tasks from the functional leads. This is really opposite of what the standard in the industry currently is. We're really moving towards pushing that onto the functional leads. So while it may not be ideal, it may be necessary. Some examples that I've done with clients is creating a TMF mailbox for relevant communication and then transferring that to the CRO on a monthly or quarterly basis. Another is centralized document uploading by having it emailed to the CRO or to a mailbox and uploaded by one individual. On the other hand, sometimes functional leads just need additional support from the TMF representative. So if it's determined centralizing is not the best approach, maybe regular meetings with focused TMF time are needed, or perhaps some additional training is all that's needed. It's also important to understand what's fully within scope when it comes to the CRO. There may be tasks that can be taken off the sponsor team and given to the CRO to handle. So I wanted to provide you guys with some examples and different ways that I've utilized with sponsors to document situations when we've had to be creative. So this includes using Excel trackers. For example, tracking access reviews in one Excel that's uploaded at the end of the study and just documented in the index. And what I like to do whenever possible is adding additional notes to the TMF index or TMF map, whatever you like to call it. It's going to be one of those first tools an inspector uses. So if it's relevant from that perspective, it's a great resource to document when and where to expect something to be filed. Some items may need to be stored in an internal shared system and just referenced in the index. An example is for product level documents that are not study specific. That's something that I'm working with a client on right now. I've also created sponsor-specific documents or forms to do what was needed, especially if it was something the CRO didn't have. Just because they don't have it doesn't mean you can't create it. And of course, I've built the details into process documents or the TMF plan itself. So whenever you're brainstorming on the best process to follow for the specific situation, it's key to ensure you are being compliant. Work on thinking outside the box, utilizing the tools and resources available within that compliance. There is more than one way to accomplish what you need. It's just a matter of finding the way for that sponsor and that situation. And this actually brings me to the end of my presentation. My contact information is here on the slide in case you need to reach out to me. But I know, yeah, we're going to jump into the question and answers. Now, I'm hoping we've got some great questions.
Yes, we have a couple. Suzanne, thank you so much. That was such a great presentation. I know a lot of smaller teams are watching today, so I know that a lot of this stuff is relevant to them. And I'm sure a lot of people found it very, very helpful. So we'll start with the first question from Raul. How do you build a process for internal review?
Ooh, that's a good one. Honestly, I do this based on my experience mostly, but you do want to take a risk-based approach and determine how I like to go about it is I like to focus on areas of concern. I like to pick, depending on the study, let's just say you have a larger study, multiple countries, multiple sites. I'm going to want to pick one or two countries and then one or two sites from each of those countries. My experience is that whatever you're finding in those few sites is going to be a trend. So if you're missing the delegation log in every site you review, you're probably missing the delegation log in all of them. Finding those key areas based on where the study is for the trial level. So where you're at, what kind of process documents should be present, what kind of plans should be present. Also taking into consideration, sorry, I had a thought and it ran away. I'm sure it'll run back in a minute, yeah. But just, keeping that risk base in mind, but also looking for some of those key elements, the elements that are going to be higher priority. Yeah, that's how I like to go about it. So it's just considering also your resources, of course, if you're a smaller pharma, having those limited resources means you really have to get risk-based. But like I said, sorry, I start to talk fast when I get excited and have thoughts going, but I'm trying to slow it down. Also take into consideration what your CRO's review entails. Because like I said, that is a key indicator to me if more sponsor review is going to be needed because the CRO is not covering enough. So you don't want to duplicate work they've done. Obviously, you do need to check some of that to make sure they aren't missing things, but working alongside what they're doing will also benefit you. So that, let's say they're covering sites X and Y, so maybe you want to cover sites A and B. So
cool. We got another big doozy from Helen Price. How do you minimize the risk if a centralized TMF team manages the TMF on behalf of functional teams, including the periodic QC? Oversight by functional teams can be documented and filed to the TMF. Should we think about annual inspection readiness checked by the functional needs, providing them with a tool to do so? They are best at understanding their documents and events, etc.
Fantastic question. Good job, Helen. Okay, so what if you did need to move to a centralized process? Okay, hold on. So if we're talking about the documents and you're moving to a centralized process, this somewhat depends on what that process is, right? If you're sending it to your CROs, I know a lot of the CROs that have TMF mailboxes, they do require the team members to actually state where things should be filed. If it's going to be internal, my expectation would be whoever that centralized person is won't hesitate to ask questions. I'm a big believer in questions. I think it shows that people are thinking, and so it never bothers me. So I would encourage that person, if you're not sure where this goes, because TMF, if a TMF person's experienced enough, they know the reference model well enough. There just may be those random things they've never seen before, or they need clarification on, to reach out and say, where did this go? Now, regarding periodic QCs, if you're going to, what I'm working with a client on now currently, the way we approach this is the TMF team does an initial review. We do kind of a high level review, and then looking into, like I was saying previously, some countries and sites, key things that based on experience, we would know that should be present. After that, we then meet with the functional leads, each of the functional leads. So because we've done pre-review, we can meet with them and this be a 30-minute meeting and say, here's what we're seeing is missing. Here's what we're seeing is present. What don't we know? Is this correct? Because that gives us the opportunity to update the index, right? Maybe our index isn't correct. But you're correct. They are the experts. So we're still meeting with them and getting their input after we've done some of the work to reduce the amount of time that they're having to put in. And then what you could do, okay, the annual. So I don't know that if you're doing these ongoing, you wouldn't really need an annual one. I would say at minimum, you should be doing 6 months. I'm a fan of quarterly, depending on the size of the TMF. But what you can also do is have them sign off. So once a review is done, I like to file something in the TMF that says, this is what we reviewed. This is who was part of it. The dates, et cetera, all those details, high level details, not what actually was found or anything, just what was covered. And then you can actually send it out and have every functional lead sign off. Like they are still taking ownership for their zone. But they didn't have to put in quite as much work doing a full review themselves because they had that TMF support. I hope that helps.
I think that was very in-depth, and I'm loving these questions that we're getting. So the next one
These
I have
are great questions. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I really think so too. coming from the lovely Oliver Pierce, we have our next one, kind of piggybacking a nice little segue after that last answer. How do you recommend structuring a sponsor oversight program for smaller sponsor teams?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I was just speaking to, Oliver, is really one of the best ways to go about it. If the sponsor has a TMF person with the right experience, if they're experienced enough, they're going to know a lot of like kind of standards. I can tell you based on 11 years and doing QC reviews and working with countries and all, like I have a general idea of what to expect, not also taking into account what type of study it is. So while I may not be an expert in the exact documents, I have a general idea of like, we're probably going to see this or not. And also how to connect documents. So I know looking at the delegation log, I'm going to look for CVs and training documents and et cetera. So if you have a skilled team of person in place, they can do a lot of the heavy lifting and then pull the functional leads in afterwards to help fill in those blanks and ensure what they're seeing is correct. So.
Perfect. I'm sure he's very happy with this answer. I see him smiling backstage. Another one from Carol Federlin. A common struggle, whether you're working with a CRO or internal sponsor, is the completeness and ownership of different functional leads and functional teams. Best practice is for the SME to review the documents. Often teams are asked by functional leads what they should have in their TMF. How do you find the balance between supporting your functions and driving home that they're responsible for the content and completeness?
Yeah, I feel you, Carol. I 100% feel you here. Everyone on this call feels you. So my approach, actually, the reason I named my company ICE Consulting is ICE stands for Inform, Connect, Engage. I'm a big believer in really informing and connecting with my team in order to get that engagement. I find that I may need to put more effort in up front, and it's going to save me a lot of effort down the road. So while they are responsible, they are the SMEs and all, that doesn't mean they don't need the TMF support. So I really like meeting with them, especially in the beginning when you're building your TMF index or map or whatever everyone likes to call it. I'm just going to call it a TMF index. When you're building that and really meeting with them. And yeah, I come across this all the time. They have no idea what should be in there. And so it's just going to be probing questions, or it may be that it needs to be passed to the CRO some for their support. I really like to actually have the reference model pulled up and show them that description. This is what it's talking about. Do you expect to see any of these type of sub artifacts that are listed here? And then if there's anything they're really not sure of, maybe it means we need to follow up with a vendor or take into consideration that not every sub artifact listed is actually required. They're examples to help them. So we still put that on them, still have them be the one to follow up with the advisors and such. But unfortunately, they do sometimes need a lot of that help in the beginning. But usually once you work with an individual, like on that first study or so, they get to the next study and now they're getting it, right? So that's the approach I take. Is I like to provide them a lot of support within reason, as long as it's them not taking advantage. I think you'll know when that's happening and be able to put up some firm lines if needed.
Perfect.
Hopefully that answers that.
That's awesome. Like I'm loving these questions. So I think we have time for two more. So I have another one from Helen. When assessing a CRO, do you look at their AI tool and process to ensure it's robust and controlled?
AI tool. That's actually a really good question. I don't think I've actually been in this situation yet, Helen. So if I were to be, I would want to. I would want to see the documentation behind it, the testing. I would expect that they would have done user testing on it, that it would have been validated just like, part of any other system. Yeah, I really unfortunately can't speak beyond that, as I haven't experienced that yet, but I like asking questions. So do it. Do it. Ask them, make
Yeah.
them prove it to you, make them prove that it can do what they say, that it's, and I would check the work of it too. Like during the study, if they have AI going in there, that it's actually doing what they say and they're not just relying on it.
Yeah, exactly. For sure. No, like Suzanne, this has been such a wonderful presentation. I think we've had such a great audience too. Thank you guys so much for your questions and the interaction. It has been absolutely wonderful.